The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dimly lit lounge, but inside, the air was thick with a heat that had nothing to do with the weather. Elena leaned against the mahogany bar, her fingers tracing the condensation on her glass, acutely aware of the shadow looming just inches to her left. Julian didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The sheer magnetism of his presence was a physical weight, a pull she had been trying to resist since the moment they met. When he finally moved, it wasn't to speak. He reached past her for a cocktail napkin, his forearm brushing against hers. It was a fleeting contact, but the friction sent a jolt through her that made her breath hitch. She looked up, intending to offer a polite, distant smile, but her gaze got locked in his. His eyes were dark, searching, and filled with a terrifyingly clear intent. The ambient noise of the room, the clinking of ice, the low hum of jazz, the distant chatter, faded into a dull roar. All she could hear was the frantic, rhythmic thud of her own heart hammering against her ribs. "You're trembling, Elena," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle deep in her chest. He didn't pull away. Instead, he took a step closer, invading her personal space until the scent of cedarwood and expensive bourbon enveloped her. He raised a hand, his thumb grazing the pulse point at the base of her throat, lingering there just long enough to feel the evidence of her nervousness. She should have stepped back. She should have made a joke to break the suffocating tension. But the way he looked at her, as if she were the only person in a crowded room, the only thing that mattered, paralyzed her. He leaned in, his lips hovering mere centimeters from her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Is it fear?" he whispered. "Or is it something else?" Elena turned her head slightly, her lips almost brushing his jawline. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, heavy with the weight of unspoken promises and a hunger that had been simmering for months. She felt his hand slide from her neck to her waist, a bold, possessive gesture that claimed the air she breathed. Just as the world seemed to tilt on its axis, Julian's phone vibrated against the bar, the harsh glow of the screen cutting through the intimacy. He glanced down, and in an instant, the predatory heat in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp flicker of something she didn't recognize. "Would you like me to write the next scene where the tension finally breaks, or shall we explore the secret Julian is hiding?" The chill that settled over Julian wasn't just a change in mood, it was a wall. Elena watched him slide the phone back into his pocket, the warmth of his hand on her waist now nothing more than a ghost of a sensation. This was the pattern, the dance they had perfected over 3 years of a marriage that looked polished on the outside but was beginning to show hairline fractures under the surface. Their history was a tapestry of high-stakes passion and low-frequency static. They had met during a chaotic summer in Paris, two ambitious souls who thought they could conquer the world together. Back then, the tension was a game, a constant spark that kept them awake until dawn. But as the years bled into one another, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of things left unsaid. Later that night, in the sterile luxury of their bedroom, the tension shifted from magnetic to melancholic. Elena sat at her vanity, removing her jewelry with trembling hands. In the mirror, she saw Julian standing by the window, his silhouette sharp against the city lights. He hadn't spoken since the lounge. "Who was it, Julian?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The person on the phone." He didn't turn around. "Work, Elena. It's always work." She stood up and walked toward him, her silk robe trailing behind her. She stopped just behind him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his back. Despite the suspicion gnawing at her gut, the physical pull was still there, infuriating and undeniable. She reached out, her palm flat against the middle of his back, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You're lying," she said softly. Julian turned then, his movement sudden and fluid. He caught her wrist, not roughly, but with a firm grip that forced her to look up at him. For a moment, the mask slipped. She saw a flash of raw, unfiltered longing in his eyes, a desperate desire to reach out to her, followed quickly by a shadow of guilt. He pulled her flush against him, his other hand tangling in her hair, tilting her head back. "Sometimes," he rasped, his eyes scanning her face as if memorizing it. "The truth is the thing that finally destroys the house we built. Do you really want to hear it?" He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Their breaths mingled, and for a heartbeat, the world felt right again. His lips brushed against hers, a soft, bruising contact that tasted of desperation. It was an apology and a plea all at once. But as he pulled her closer, his touch lacked the reverence it once had. There was a frantic edge to it now, as if he were trying to drown out the truth with the noise of their desire. Elena felt the crack in her heart widen. She loved him, but she was starting to realize that love wasn't a shield against the rot of hidden secrets. As his hands traced the familiar curves of her body, she wondered if he was holding her because he couldn't let go, or because he was terrified of what would happen when he finally did. "Would you like me to write the next scene where Elena discovers a physical piece of evidence that confirms her fears?" The following evening, the air at the charity gala was stifling, a cocktail of expensive perfume and whispered scandals. Elena stood by the arched balcony, watching Julian from across the ballroom. He was locked in conversation with a woman Elena didn't recognize, a woman whose hand lingered a second too long on Julian's sleeve, whose laughter was a little too bright, a little too intimate. The jealousy hit Elena like a physical blow, sharp and jagged. It wasn't just that Julian was talking to someone else. It was the way he wasn't looking for her. The unspoken pact they had, the invisible thread that always kept them connected in a crowd, had snapped. "He looks like he's forgotten he's being watched," a low voice rumbled beside her. Elena startled, turning to find Marcus, Julian's fiercest business rival and a man who had made his attraction to Elena no secret. Marcus didn't maintain a polite distance. He leaned against the stone railing, his shoulder nearly touching hers. He was the temptation she had always ignored, the what-if that lingered in the corners of her mind when the silence at home became too loud. "Julian is just being polite," Elena said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Politeness doesn't look that hungry," Marcus countered, his eyes dark with a dangerous kind of empathy. He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The gesture was overly familiar, a bold provocation. "You're glowing with resentment, Elena. It's a tragedy to see a woman like you become a ghost in her own life." She should have walked away, but the sting of Julian's perceived indifference kept her rooted to the spot. Marcus moved closer, his presence a sharp contrast to Julian's cold distance. He was fire where Julian was ice. "I wouldn't let you stand alone," Marcus whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. Suddenly, a hand gripped Elena's waist, pulling her back with a possessive jerk. Julian had appeared out of the shadows, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. The air between the two men crackled with a primitive, violent tension. Julian didn't look at Marcus. He looked only at Elena, his thumb pressing firmly into the silk of her dress. "We're leaving," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The drive home was a blur of neon lights and heavy, suffocating silence. The moment the door to their penthouse clicked shut, Julian pinned her against the wood, his body a wall of heat and anger. "You let him touch you," he rasped, his eyes burning with a mix of jealousy and something far darker. "In front of everyone." "You were busy," she spat back, her heart racing against her chest. "I thought you'd moved on." Julian's grip tightened, his face inches from hers. The line between rage and desire blurred until it disappeared entirely. "You think I could ever move on from you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Even when I'm destroying us, I'm still yours." He leaned in, his lips grazing hers in a way that felt less like a kiss and more like a claim, just as the sound of a key turning in the front door echoed through the hallway. "Should I reveal who has the spare key and just walked in on them, or would you like to see Elena confront Julian about the woman at the gala first?" The intruder was gone as quickly as they had arrived, a panicked retreat into the night, but the damage was done. The interruption had shattered the fragile glass of their shared anger, leaving only raw, exposed nerves. Julian didn't let go of her. If anything, his grip tightened, pulling her away from the door and into the dimly lit sanctuary of his private study. The room smelled of old leather and the lingering scent of the woman from the gala. Elena felt the walls closing in. "Who has a key, Julian? Who was that?" she demanded, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned her around, trapping her between his arms against the heavy oak desk. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes of light and shadow across his face, making him look like a stranger. "It doesn't matter," he whispered, his voice thick with a desperate, forbidden energy. "Nothing matters except the fact that I'm losing you, and I don't know how to stop it." He moved closer, his chest heaving against hers. The proximity was intoxicating, a chaotic blend of the love they once had and the resentment that was now poisoning it. He reached up, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones with a tenderness that hurt more than his coldness ever could. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps. She wanted to push him away, to scream for the truth, but her body betrayed her, leaning into his warmth. "You're a liar, Julian," she breathed, her lips inches from his. "I am," he admitted, his eyes searching hers with a haunting intensity. "I've lied about where I've been. I've lied about the money. But I have never lied about how much I need you." He leaned down, his nose sliding against hers, his breath hitching as he inhaled her scent. The air in the room felt like it was vibrating, pulled taut like a wire ready to snap. His hand slid down to the small of her back, arching her body toward his, a silent plea for a forgiveness either of them believed in. It was the most honest they had been in years, a moment of pure, unfiltered attraction stripped of all the pretenses. Just as Elena reached up to pull him closer, her hand brushed against the hidden latch under the lip of the desk. A shallow drawer clicked open, revealing a velvet box and a stack of photographs. Julian froze. His eyes darted to the drawer, and the blood drained from his face. Elena's hand shook as she reached for the top photo. "Julian," she whispered, her voice breaking as she saw the image. "What have you done? Would you like me to reveal the shocking contents of those photos, or should we see Julian's final attempt to stop her from looking?" Elena's fingers brushed the glossy surface of the photographs, and the world went silent. In the flicker of the moonlight, the images weren't of another woman, or a secret bank account. They were of her. Dozens of photos captured her every move over the last 3 months, leaving her office, meeting a friend for coffee, even standing on the very balcony where she had spoken to Marcus earlier that night. But it wasn't the surveillance that made her blood run cold. It was the handwriting on the back of the prints. It wasn't Julian's. "You weren't protecting me from a scandal, Julian," Elena whispered, her voice cracking as she turned the photo over to reveal a chilling message. Asterisk, she looks beautiful when she's lonely. Almost ready. Asterisk. You were protecting me from him. Julian's eyes closed for a brief, agonizing second. The possessive rage she had seen earlier wasn't jealousy. It was terror. "I found them in our mailbox a month ago," he rasped, his voice raw. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to live in fear. I thought if I stayed close, if I pushed everyone else away, I could keep you safe." He stepped toward her, the space between them vanishing. The air was electric, charged with the revelation that his distance hadn't been a lack of love, but a suffocating, desperate devotion. He grabbed her waist, pulling her flush against his body with a force that took her breath away. "The woman at the gala? She's a private investigator. I was paying her to find out who is sending these." The betrayal Elena felt wasn't an affair of the heart, but an affair of secrets. Yet, looking into his eyes, she saw the man who had been drowning in silence to keep her head above water. The attraction between them flared into something volatile, a mix of relief, fury, and a hunger that had been starved for far too long. "You should have told me," she hissed, her hands clutching his lapels, shaking him. "You let me believe we were dying." "I was dying," Julian groaned, his forehead dropping against hers. "Every day I didn't touch you, every night I slept on the other side of that bed, I was dying." His mouth found hers then, not with the tentative grace of a husband, but with the frantic, risky passion of a man who had almost lost everything. It was a collision of teeth and tongues, a desperate reclamation. He lifted her onto the mahogany desk, scattering the evidence of their nightmare across the floor. His hands were everywhere, tracing her skin, pulling her closer, as if he could merge their souls and hide her inside his own skin. In that moment of raw, unbridled connection, the front door, which they had forgotten to bolt, creaked open slowly. A heavy, rhythmic footstep echoed in the hallway, accompanied by the low whistle of a familiar tune. Julian froze, his body shielding Elena's as he reached into the open desk drawer for something much heavier than a photograph. "Would you like me to reveal the identity of the person in the hallway, or should we focus on the final confrontation between Julian and the stalker?" The shadows in the hallway lengthened as the whistling grew louder, a hauntingly cheerful melody that sliced through the heavy silence of the study. Julian's hand closed around the cold steel of a pistol he had kept hidden, his muscles coiling like a spring. He pushed Elena behind him, his body a living shield. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating tremor. The door swung wide. Standing in the frame was Marcus. But the polished, charming rival from the gala was gone. His tie was loosened, his eyes were bright with a manic, flickering light, and in his hand, he held a single white rose, the same flower Elena found on her doorstep every morning for a week. "I told you, Julian," Marcus said, his voice eerily calm. "She looks beautiful when she's lonely. But you just couldn't let her be lonely, could you? You had to play the hero one last time." The confrontation exploded in an instant. Julian didn't hesitate. He lunged, not to shoot, but to tackle the threat away from Elena. The two men crashed into the hallway, a chaotic blur of limbs and muffled grunts. Elena scrambled off the desk, her heart leaping into her throat as she heard the sickening thud of a fist meeting bone. "Julian!" she screamed, her voice breaking the spell of terror. She saw them grappling on the floor, the man who had lied to protect her and the man who had stalked her to possess her. It wasn't just a physical fight. It was the culmination of years of professional and personal vitriol. Marcus managed to pin Julian, his fingers clawing at Julian's throat. "She was never yours to keep," Marcus hissed. "You don't deserve her devotion." Elena didn't think. She grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from the side table and swung it with every ounce of her bottled-up rage. It shattered against Marcus's shoulder, the impact jarring enough to send him reeling. Julian seized the opening, throwing a decisive punch that sent Marcus sprawling into the darkness of the corridor, unconscious. Silence rushed back into the room, heavy and suffocating. Julian stayed on the floor for a moment, gasping for air, his shirt torn and blood trickling from a cut on his lip. Elena dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she touched his face. "Is it over?" she whispered, the tears finally breaking through. Julian looked at her, really looked at her, stripping away the last of his defenses. He reached out, pulling her into a fierce, trembling embrace. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. "I'm sorry," he choked out, his head buried in her neck. "I thought I could handle it alone. I thought I was strong enough to be your wall, but I ended up being your cage." Elena pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. The anger was gone, burned away by the realization of how close they had come to the end. "We aren't those people anymore, Julian," she said, her voice firm despite the tears. "No more walls. No more cages." The consequences of their secrets lay scattered around them like broken glass, but as Julian leaned in to kiss her, a slow, bruising contact that tasted of salt and survival, the bridge between them finally held. "Would you like me to write the final scene where they rebuild their life together, or should we end with one last lingering threat from Marcus?" 6 months later, the shadows of that night had finally retreated, replaced by the soft, golden glow of a Mediterranean sunset. Elena stood on the terrace of their small villa, the scent of blooming jasmine and sea salt filling the air. There were no cameras here, no rivals, and no secrets hidden in mahogany drawers. For the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't a weapon, it was a sanctuary. She felt Julian before she heard him. The familiar heat of his presence settled behind her, but this time, There was no tension in his approach. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck, a gesture that had once been a possessive claim but was now a simple, tender anchor. "You're thinking too loud again," he murmured, his voice vibrating softly against her skin. Elena leaned her head back, closing her eyes. "Just thinking about how different the silence feels now." Julian turned her in his arms, his hands sliding up to cup her face. The coldness that had once defined his gaze had thawed into something deep and unwavering. The cut on his lip had healed into a faint, silver scar, a permanent reminder of the night respect was rebuilt from the ashes of their old life. "I spent so long trying to be the man who had everything under control," Julian said, his eyes searching hers with a raw honesty. "I didn't realize that the only thing worth having was the one thing I couldn't control, the way you look at me when you truly see me." He leaned down, kissing the tip of her nose before his lips moved to the pulse point at her throat, lingering there. Elena's heart didn't race with the frantic anxiety of the past, it beat with a steady, rhythmic certainty. She ran her fingers through his hair, drawing him closer, savoring the friction of his skin against hers. "We lost a lot that night," Elena whispered, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "The illusions, the safety we thought we had. But we found this," Julian countered. He reached into his pocket, but instead of a phone or a secret, he pulled out a small, simple gold band, a replacement for the one she had stopped wearing during their coldest months. He slid it onto her finger, his touch lingering. "A love that doesn't need to hide." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and deep orange. Julian pulled her into a deep, slow kiss, one that tasted of salt, wine, and 1,000 unspoken promises kept. The passion was still there, as bold and electric as ever, but it was anchored by a newfound reverence. As the stars began to pierce through the twilight, they walked back inside together, leaving the doors wide open to the night air. The story that had begun with a charged silence and a hidden threat had ended in the loudest way possible, with two souls finally, fearlessly at peace. I hope you enjoyed this story. Would you like me to help you brainstorm a title and description for another YouTube story, or perhaps develop a different ending for this one?